Dobrý večer, good evening everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to our discussion about the state of the book market in 2020 as part of Knihex. Let me start by introducing maybe first myself. I'm Ondřej Lipa, I'm a writer and a journalist, and I have three wonderful guests from all around Europe who will discuss with me what has happened this year and maybe what's coming next year. First, let me welcome Alexandra Bichle, Director of Literature Across Frontiers. Our second guest is Olivia Snaije, a journalist, editor and author based in Paris. Welcome, Olivia. And our third distinguished guest is Per Bergtrom from Sweden, from the small publishing house Ramos. Welcome, Per.
Thank you.
Just before we begin, let me say, and I'm not sure if I should say it in Czech or in English, but let's say in English, that you can watch this stream on the website of Knihex. You can watch it on Knihex YouTube and on the Facebook page. You can watch it on the Facebook pages of Czechlit, České literární centrum, of Městská knihovna, the Prague Municipal Library, and of Knihovna Václava Havla, Václav Havel's library. If you have any questions, you, the viewers, we will save 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our discussions for that. Write your questions on the social media under our stream. We will gather them and we will see them. So if you find anything that you want to get deeper into, let us know. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. I also want to thank our co-organizers, which are the Czech Literary Centrum, Czechlit, the Municipal Library in Prague, Městská knihovna, and Literature Across Frontiers. So let us begin. Thank you all for joining me. Maybe before we sink into the tough questions and the deep stuff, can we maybe just go through a short round of us sharing how was this spring lockdown for you as readers, not as professionals, but as people who love books and love literature? Maybe starting with Alexandra. Did you find enough time to read, and what was your good read for this spring?
Thank you, Ondřej, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here at Knihex. Well, what can I say? I mean, the pandemic has really brought a lot of changes, and I have to say I didn't have more time to read. I had less time because reorganizing our work and cancelling a lot of events that we had planned, reorganizing them to turn them into digital events, and at the same time being part of various discussions about how to solve the situation, both in the UK and at European and international level, has taken up a lot of time. So I have been busier than before, unfortunately. So that's your answer.
Thank you. Olivia, what was it better for you? Did you find time to read and to enjoy literature? Turn your microphone on, please.
I have to say that it didn't change so much for me because I work from home anyway. Perhaps like Alexandra, I was busier even than usual, but I always read quite a bit, so I continued to read a lot. I read a lot of literature and translation, and you asked us to mention some of the books. So, I mean, I loved both books that won the Man Booker and the International Man Booker. So there was The Discomfort of Evening by Marijke Lucas Reinveld, translated by Michelle Hutchinson, I think. That was wonderful. And then, and I loved Shuggie Bain by Douglas Shore, is it? I'm not sure. Anyway, from Scotland, that was wonderful. And then I read a massive book, a Georgian book, but it was written in German, The Eighth Life by Nino Harachvili. So that was
wonderful.
those
So we
were
can
3
take it
books.
also as tips for buying presents for Christmas.
Exactly.
And Per, did you find a good book for the spring to lift your spirits?
Well, I don't know if my situation didn't change so much either when it comes to reading, but I think instead of finding something that lifted my spirit, I went back to reread, for example, Death in Venice by Thomas Mann and The Plague by Camus and so on, to try to cope with the situation more or less, and find literary works about pandemics, you know.
I actually think that that's a very good way to approach it. I found out that some of my friends and me also found some comfort in finding stories that were closer to what we were going through.
I actually reread Karel Čapek, for example, so that was...
There you go. So going to our main topic today, I think we can all agree that 2020 was a dramatic year on basically every level that we can imagine. But for the book sector and for the book market, it was in many ways devastating. We have lots of events that were cancelled, and I mean the big ones. Most of the book fairs, Leipzig, London, Warsaw, and Prague, of course, were cancelled. Some of them went online. Bologna went online. Frankfurt was basically digital this year. So everything changed. And for the beginning, I wanted to ask if you, in your respective countries or regions, because I should say that Per will probably be talking not only about Sweden, but also about Denmark and Norway, and Alexandra will mention not only the UK, but also Wales and maybe some other European countries. And Olivia is based in Paris, so I think she will mainly mention France. But what was the first reaction? What was the first response of book publishers and the state in your countries to the spring lockdown and its effects on the book sector? Because most of the booksellers were closed down and couldn't sell. Most publishing houses went into a state of chaos and started slowing down their production and maybe moving the new titles to next year, or maybe even cancelling them altogether. Per, would you like to start, please?
Well, as you might know, Sweden hasn't really had the same approach to the disease as most other European countries. We never had a lockdown, so we were asked to work from home, to try to stay at home as much as possible. But all the bookstores and so all the libraries were still open, even though the libraries sort of announced that it didn't want people to come there if it wasn't absolutely necessary. So I think at first there was a huge amount of nervosity, and people were scared, and the business was scared. But the effect hasn't been as big as one might have been scared of. I think in Sweden, for example, the book sales has remained pretty much the same, even though the physical bookstores have dropped their sales and there has been more online sales. What affected us during the spring, though, was that the libraries telling people not to come there. Their buying of physical books dropped with 65%, turning it over to ebooks instead, making people borrow ebooks from home, and which, of course, as an independent publisher, as we are trying to sell poetry, which are not really good in an ebook way, it meant a lot to us with these numbers. But for the sales for the bookstore, it wasn't that bad. Also, then the cancellations of events also have a lot of big effects, and there the state came in with a support that you can actually apply for grants if you had literary events cancelled. So this was quite good, and it's quite different, as I understand, from Denmark, where a lot of people in the cultural sector were very upset in May, where the Minister of Culture of Denmark said that at these troubled times we do not have time for culture. And here on the other way around, they quite early announced an extra 100 million euros for cultures and sports, actually, as a grant.
I think that's a reaction that was somehow similar here in the Czech Republic. We saw some efforts to help the cultural sector, but it was mostly focused on the big companies, on what the ministry calls the culture industry, and not necessarily the smaller businesses and smaller publishing houses. And from the part that I know, not on authors. It's interesting what you said about libraries. I think we will come back to that, because I think libraries played a big role in this year in trying to compensate the effects that the book industry felt. Olivia, can you talk about the situation in France in spring?
Well, we've had 2 lockdowns, and so the first one was March 17th to the 11th of May, where it was really completely locked down, very severe, in contrast to Sweden, for example. I think at first it was a huge shock, but the government, you know, France has a very strong cultural policy, so the government did immediately react, and they had an emergency aid package for culture in general of 22 million euros, of which 5 million euros were for the book industry. And of course, this wasn't enough. And they've been augmenting this in several waves. So there's been funding for publishers, for the smaller independent publishers, for authors, and also for bookshops, because France is very lucky to have a super strong chain of bookshops. This is one of the key parts of the book industry. We have over 3,000 independent bookshops all over France. So they were helped too. So at first it was quite dire, and but then things sort of got going, and it seems that the end of the year is not going to be so bad. And I can talk about the second lockdown a bit later, but it's the government has given a lot of help.
That sounds quite optimistic, because I mean, I completely agree with what you said. I think France has a very strong cultural policy, and the state is doing as much as it can to keep the book market diverse. And if I'm not mistaken, France still has a similar system somehow to Germany, with keeping set prices of books, which also helps.
We have a fixed book price, which has, I mean, people have, everyone agrees that it saved the book market. And so that's still very strong. And there were lots of things put in place, for example, free shipping. So the government took over there was free shipping of books. The bookshops started doing this, what they call click and collect. I don't know, where people could order and then they would come by, delivery and so on. So I'm not saying it was perfect, but people have reacted. And there are also strong unions. So the booksellers union is very strong. They make a lot of noise. One interesting thing that happened was, during the first lockdown, is the Minister of Culture actually suggested that books were an essential necessity, and he said that, well, perhaps bookshops could be open. And then the union of booksellers said, well, we're not ready. We can't assure everyone's safety, because it's true, at the time no one had masks and people didn't know anything. So they actually said, no, we're not going to open. And then during the second lockdown, which we're still in lockdown officially until the 15th of December, they wanted to open, and they weren't allowed to open until midway through the lockdown. So there was a bit of confusion there, but things seem to have worked out because they're now open.
Okay, thank you. Alexander, can you compare it, what the approach was in France to what happened in the UK and in Wales? Because from what you wrote to me before our discussion is that the system of handling cultural issues is kind of different in England and in Wales and in Scotland.
Yes, I think that's the first thing that one has to say when you're talking about anything happening in the UK, that it consists of what we refer to as 4 nations, and the area of culture and education are 2 areas that are managed at what we again refer to devolved level. Cultural policy, I mean, there is a cultural policy for the UK, and that relates, for example, to also how the UK presents itself culturally and how it manages its cultural links and relations with other countries through the British Council, for example. But it's really important to realize that each of the 4 nations, including Wales, which is where we are based, has its own cultural policy and manages culture at that level. So we have 3 arts councils, and also that's another thing, that culture is really managed through these arm's length institutions, the arts councils. So we have the Arts Council of England, we have Arts Council of Wales. In Scotland, it's called Creative Scotland, and then there's the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. So also managing the pandemic happened at local level. And I have to say that I have stopped, really paying attention to the exact limitations and restrictions and when the next lockdown starts or when it finished. What we have now is that we have in England, and Wales as well, it's managed by area, so it depends very much on the number of infections and so on at a more local level. But then there are also blanket restrictions. There's also a restriction on, for instance, travel between England and Wales. So it's very complicated. What we know is that the lockdown came too late in March. That's something we all agree on, and it should have happened earlier. And of course, it did affect everything. It affected, people's lives. Yes, bookshops were closed, and again, we have quite a different situation. We don't have as many independent bookshops as France has, for example. We have large chains, etc. We have libraries that have been closing, and so it is a very different situation here. At the same time, the government did provide an immediate kind of rescue package, but also what has happened, and again, I think this is important to realize, that the measures were kind of divided between measures for businesses and measures for individual artists who are actually for taxation purposes and so on are considered, unless they are employed, which is very rare. They are freelancers. So there were various measures applied to people who are basically freelance or self-employed for tax purposes. Companies, and when I say companies, again, in the UK, large cultural organizations have usually charity status, but the smaller ones are companies, and they would be companies with charitable status or companies that do not have, don't distribute profits, etc., etc. So all these are quite different circumstances. So, for example, the government introduced a measure which was called job retention scheme, where employers received a certain amount to be able to cover salaries of people who really couldn't, do their jobs. And these people were basically supposed to stay at home and not work. For freelancers, there were various guidelines. You had to, essentially what you had to do was you had to prove that you were losing income because of the pandemic. So it's quite a complicated picture. In terms of arts assistance, the government made an amount available, which was distributed through the arts councils. And I'm just looking at the figures. So yes, so the support, for example, that was distributed in Wales amounted to 7 million in the first tranche in April, and then to 53 million, which was introduced in July, and that was administered by the Arts Council and by the Welsh government directly. So that I don't talk too long, I just want to explain that Wales is quite a small country. It has just over 3 million inhabitants, and it's a bilingual country. So we have a situation whereby we have two languages that are co-official languages, so to speak, and the whole area of culture happens in these two languages. There is a books council that supports publishing, and maybe I can get back to this later so that I don't talk for too long, but it is quite a complex picture.
Let me just following what you said, the numbers that you mentioned and the amount of money that you mentioned seems quite big, but did you find the help adequate? Was it really as good as it sounds, and did it really help? What was the effect as good as it was intended from your point of view? Just from I mean, asking about your opinion.
Well, let me put it this way. I think generally organizations received support, which I suppose was adequate given the whole situation. The difficulty really starts with freelancers, and where organizations were given funding from the rescue package, and I also have to say that the whole structure of funding was completely went through a complete overhaul. So for example, we were supposed to be looking at there's long-term funding available to organizations, and that was supposed to be it goes for a certain number of years and so on. So that whole fund is not going to be distributed until later. So there were various programs that organizations could apply for in the knowledge that things will be different next year and in the future. So generally speaking, also some of these larger organizations benefited from the job retention scheme. So they had employees who couldn't do their work, and they just stayed at home, or worked much more part-time, etc. So the whole landscape changed, but I would say that yes, the support was very welcome. And at the same time, we were all encouraged to think of the freelancers, and come up. So we had to come up with proposals which would be funded, where paying freelancers played quite a large role.
It's very interesting to me because I think, but by accident or by chance, this year was actually the year when the Czech Arts Council, what we have here, started basically their research into who, for tax purposes and for legal purposes, is a freelance artist, and how do you define that, and who isn't, and the first session with members of the say artist organizations actually happened after the first lockdown, and so in a way this kind of support wasn't really possible here, and it showed, especially now in autumn, when the government opened their second package of let's say, help for the cultural sector, and the only people who could apply for direct help from the freelancers were performing artists, so musicians, actors, and writers and translators weren't really included in that, and so that's something we have to work for in the future. I want to go back to a thing Per mentioned, and that was moving to more using ebooks and using ebooks with libraries. Per, can you maybe comment on how fast the process is, not only commenting this year, but if that's something that you, as a small publisher, have to work on or have been working on for the past few years, and now you just needed to speed it up, or was it just something that you were prepared to do, and it was an easy transition?
Well, it is because the ebook development in Sweden has been quite slow, actually, compared to a lot of the rest of Europe. By parts, depending on that the main publisher organization made a deal with the libraries that didn't really. It's quite expensive for the libraries to lend ebooks, and therefore they do not stock as many as to the full prices. The thing is that, on the other hand, audiobooks is becoming extremely popular, and it has more or less taken away the paperback market in Sweden, actually, by audiobooks, and this has increased enormously, depending on the COVID-19 situation as well. I read somewhere that it has increased the audiobook market with almost 35% this year in Sweden. And it is tough, because as an independent publisher, you really feel that you had to jump on that train, like you want to be part of it. But the audiobook market is really a bestseller book market. It's hard to get your book out there. And also, we have those sort of Spotify services for audiobooks, where the payment you get is extremely low. We were thinking, for example, to make an ebook of a poetry book, which would take about 1 hour to listen to, and then you get paid per hour that the book is listened to. And if we would reach out to the 1,500 listeners of poetry that Hans would say is possible in Sweden, we would earn something like 300 euros. So it's really a market that is not, it is so expensive to produce them, and we can't really get the regain of it. On the other hand, ebooks now, I think there are a lot of independent publishers that have spent a lot of time this year to go through their backlist and make ebooks of them. But it's hard to find a financial gain actually from it. I would say it's tough. But in the grants that we have now had from the Swedish Art Council, there are also grants that are for sort of digital redistribution. So you can apply for grant to make digital events, for example, and look over your digital catalog in a way. So it's happening, but it's really a tough market, I would say. And I mean, then I'm an independent publisher of translated poetry. I know when I talk about tough markets.
Thank you. That's exactly what I thought. I think that the data that we have from publishers and booksellers is telling us that audiobooks were truly huge this year, but they didn't really compensate the losses from the usual selling of classical books. And the second thing is exactly what you mentioned. The costs for producing audiobooks are prohibitive for a lot of the smaller publishing houses. I even think for the middle part of the market. Olivia, have audiobooks taken off in France? Is the development similar to what Per described?
I think they're developing. but it's not a huge market yet, like the US or the UK. I spoke to an independent publisher who said that he doesn't produce audiobooks, he outsources them, and it's not a big source of revenue. On the other hand, ebooks, which were not that developed here, have grown a lot, and libraries saw their loans going up twice, so it doubled the amount, and more people became members of libraries. And ebooks have been doing better in general. But I'd say the same thing as Per, that audiobooks are growing, but it's mainly the big companies that have bestsellers, and it's not going to be the smaller ones. Again, in France, everything is very much linked to bookshops, and so a lot of effort has been gone into marketing so that people will go to bookshops. It's interesting, Per, you mentioned bestsellers, and indie booksellers, indie publishers. It was difficult for them because when the bookshops closed, you didn't have the booksellers recommending their books. And so people bought a lot of bestsellers because they heard about them on radio shows or they saw advertisements, which independent publishers didn't have the means, to do. So they lost out on that count. But as soon as bookshops opened, then the sales went up and really increased and did very well, because you had this strong sort of support of independent publishers from the independent bookshops.
If I just can fill in, this is our problem as well, because the literary events are really not only the place where the author can meet the audience and the readers, but it's also a way for us to make the newspaper interviews and get the attention, get more reviews, because the writer is visiting us. And since we can't bring any writers here, so we can't do any events, we actually lose that part as well. And it's harder for us to reach out in the art pages as well.
I think we all know that the EU has promised some kind of support package for the next year, so that the member states can really take that and start rebuilding and compensating for the damages that have been done. From what I know from the Czech Republic, part of the money that's intended for culture is actually meant for digitization. And I think it will be interesting to see if it makes sense and for which part of the market it really makes sense. Just following what Olivia and Per said about creating the content and distributing it for smaller publishers and booksellers. Alexandra, is the UK planning something similar? Because we are in a very strange state now that we are expecting Brexit deal, no deal, but basically the UK and Wales and rest of the UK is in a way in a state of limbo from what I see. So is there any support package expected in 2021?
Well, let me say a few things. One is that I haven't mentioned Brexit yet, but obviously we have been dealing with this double disaster. What now is beginning to look very seriously like no deal Brexit. And what this means is not just the impact of what's going to happen. And we're talking, food shortages of medication and so on, in the middle of a pandemic when people are losing jobs already and so on. So it's an insane situation. But we still don't know. We still don't know what to prepare for. So the government has been, sending these messages out to businesses to prepare, but they really don't know exactly for what. And they just know that the paperwork is going to be increased, that there will be lots of obstacles, and so on and so on. So obviously this also affects the book industry. And one has to remember that, of course, the English-speaking publishing sector is huge. And, you know, in Frankfurt, it takes up the whole hall, or used to take up the whole hall, hall 8. And so the UK publishing, I think, is something like, represents something like 17% of global publishing. US publishing, you know, is 29% and so on. So it is really huge. And of course you have all the, you know, Commonwealth countries that publish in English as well. So it's really very difficult to compare it to anything. And, you know, there's over 100,000 books published every year in the UK. I mean, it's vast. So I don't think these comparisons are very useful. It's really important to look at independent publishers, and there is a number of very small independent publishers in the UK who actually receive support from the Arts Council. And that's really in England the only form of support for publishing. In Wales, and I have some more figures for you in case you thought that, you know, we're getting a good deal. It gets even better because the Books Council, and I didn't mention the support that the Books Council provides for Welsh publishers, is over 2 million a year. And 1.5 million of that goes to Welsh language publishers, again, to, you know, to support them because of the difficult market they're facing. So it is really, it's quite a different situation. The Books Council, just to explain, doesn't just provide these subsidies, they also distribute books. And they distribute books through about 800 outlets. So you can actually order a book published by a Welsh publisher on their website, on the website of the Books Council, but you can also order it from the publisher directly. And then you go and collect it in a local bookshop. And I'm not sure whether it always works as smoothly as it sounds, but obviously there was a lot of obstacles with the pandemic, starting with the fact that, you know, the people couldn't sort of really go and to the warehouse, and bookshops were closed and so on. So I just wanted to say this now, with looking at how independent publishers have been dealing with this. And you mentioned audiobooks and ebooks and so on. Well, ebooks have been already big, and I myself buy a lot of ebooks because it's so easy, and, you know, you can kind of instantly be able to read and have it on, you know, on your iPad or whatever, or Kindle. But when it comes to audiobooks, it's exactly as Per said, or Olivia as well. The smaller independent publishers really don't find that is an option for them or solution. And at the same time, what has happened is that there have been lots and lots of events online. And practically every publisher, small publisher, you know, started doing readings online and book launches online and so on. And it's almost, when you look at how they operate, and that goes for, you know, England, Scotland, Wales, that independent publishers have their following. They are very much in touch with their consumers, so to speak, with their readers. And so it's a kind of niche market. It's not a market that makes anybody rich, quite on the contrary. But there is a kind of strong connection between small publishers, and I'm sure Per would agree with this, that you must have a similar situation, whether they publish poetry or fiction or both. I actually asked the kind of leading independent, because we only have independent publishers in Wales. So I asked Parthian Books, who mainly, they publish Welsh authors. They publish young authors. So, you know, if you're an emerging author, you go to them. And they publish both fiction and poetry, non-fiction essays. They have a kind of heritage or historical list and so on. So they do quite a lot. But still, you know, they're not a large publisher. And what they said to me is that they actually did really much better. They kind of starting at the start of the pandemic, obviously people had to orientate themselves, you know, suddenly you can't work from your office, etc., etc. But what they told me is that they had the time to really reflect on what they're doing, look at their list, you know, think about it, and organize events, which actually didn't cost them anything because they didn't have to, you know, hire a venue or you know, provide the usual cost or pay for travel for authors. So somehow their response was that actually things weren't that bad for them, and it's interesting. It may be an unusual situation. On the whole, there have been losses, and they estimated at around £1 million in again for Welsh publishing. But apparently things improved in the summer when bookshops could open. And of course, direct supply of books to your readers with whom you are very much in touch also seems to have, you know, played a role.
From what you're saying, it almost seems to me that 2020 was basically the best thing that could happen to the independent publishers. But
no, I don't think so. I don't think so. But
yes, I agree, because
this is an example. This is an example, you know, from a small country which is bilingual, and where I think there is a kind of commitment to local writers in both languages, and a publisher like Parthian or another one, Seren, they have a fantastic poetry list, have their following.
I found really interesting what Olivia said about bestsellers and the big publishing houses being able to promote their goods, their products, in the situation where the smaller just couldn't. So maybe giving this back to Olivia, do you think isn't this situation really a double-edged sword? On one hand, really bringing the audience around the independent publishing houses closer together, and maybe rallying for their brand, and on the other hand, the big companies really having the power to be present in the media and to advertise and to promote.
Well, I think this is a question that goes beyond the COVID pandemic. I mean, it's always been a problem, and yeah, I mean, the bestseller versus, you know, getting all the press and so on. But I've spoken to a couple of independent publishers who this year, because they had to stay home, were able to spend more time on marketing. So this is similar to what Alexandra said. For example, I spoke to David Mulman, who owns Aux Forges du Vulcain, which they're part of a collective. It's a very interesting model, because in France you have the problem of overproduction of books, and you know, they were hoping to produce fewer books this year, but it doesn't seem so, even though they postponed. Most publishers postponed books. And anyway, so this publisher is part of a collective where they're trying to reduce their number of books, and so they share resources. So they're independent publishers based on a system of equalization. So they'll share a printer, and they kind of you know, work together in this sense. And so he said that he, for example, spent usually pre-pandemic, he would spend 1 day a week traveling to a city in France where he would visit 5 bookshops and to show them his books, even though he has salespeople doing that on top of it. anyway, this year he couldn't do that. So he spent all that free time on marketing, developing a YouTube channel. And as a result, probably was able to work more on one. I mean, he produces, I think, he publishes 10 books a year, but he was able to spend more time on each book. And there was another publisher I spoke to called Les Éditions de la Goutte d'Or, and they really only put out maybe 3 or 4 books. But again, they spent sort of a really dedicated amount of time on each book to really make sure that everyone knew about it, that they had events online and so on. So I don't know if that answered your question about bestsellers, but yes, I think independent publishers were able to reinforce certain aspects of the marketing that they maybe didn't have time to do before.
So do you think we will be seeing more of these kind of changes in the way smaller publishers and independent publishers approach the way they work, they promote, and maybe joining forces together and creating these kinds of collectives so that they can share their costs and maybe benefit from working together?
It's possible. I mean, there was an interesting op-ed piece which was signed by lots of independent publishers and artists and writers and so on, who were saying, well, this pandemic has given pause for reflection, and let's try and think about the real problems that we have in France. In other words, overproduction, the bigger publishing houses sort of absorbing other publishing houses. So we're seeing this case right now in the US with Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. So let's address this, and also let's see how we can fight against huge online platforms like Amazon. I mean, in France, there's a real sort of movement against Amazon and these big companies. So for example, again, the government has given money, I think it's 6 million euros to bookshops to develop their online sales possibilities and so on. So yeah, let's hope that it allows people to reflect and think more about maybe a different way of doing things.
Per, did you see a similar development in Scandinavian countries, or is this something that has been happening and we are just seeing let's say people giving it more energy and more time in the year that they could?
In some extent, yes. A very good example is a fantastic publishing house called Tranan. Publishes also translated fiction like Lispector, Jamaica Kincaid, Nora Eccleston, and so on this year. And they have really made an effort to put things online, to find bookstagrammers instead of and so on, and trying to reach out, and reach out through their webpage and through their social media. And they have succeeded. I think 7% of their sales are now from their own webpage, which is quite big. Then you can also see that the larger publishing houses are buying smaller ones here. I think there are 3 publishing houses controlling about 84% of the Swedish book market. On the other hand, I think something that all publishing houses, big or small, has suffered from is that since all newspaper journalists and reviewers, critics has also been working from home, the review copies haven't reached out. So if you have a first day of reviews where usually like the main publishing house would have their book reviewed in all newspapers, this time it can take months before the reviews show up because the books haven't reached the reviewer actually. So that are 2 ways. I think there are no competition among us independent smaller publishing houses. We are helping each other a lot actually, more or at least supporting each other. And so already we don't have our own printing houses and printing machines, but we work together at the book fairs. We work with the for example, with this Tranan that I mentioned. Since we are based in southern Sweden and they are based in Stockholm, which is more than 700 kilometers apart, they do those visits at the bookstores there, and we do them for them in southern Sweden instead. So we have this cooperation since before, I would say.
It's always encouraging to hear, and I'm glad to say that we've been seeing a similar kind of development here in the Czech Republic this spring. From what I saw, Knihex has turned from being a small book fair to being a platform that really connects smaller publishers who take part in the book fair, and now they are working together as a community, as I would even say a lobbying group now, and communicating with the Ministry of Culture and working together to really change things and for the independent publishers to really have their voice heard, because I don't think they really had before. I need to ask about one thing which we are actually part of. The move towards being online and literary events being digital, and poetry readings happening on Zoom, that has all taken off, and we've all experienced that. I have to personally say that after 2, maybe 3 months, I was sort of exhausted by watching always 4 people being on screen and trying to read and perform what would usually be a really nice event happening in a small cafe with a great atmosphere. Did you experience something similar? And if so, can you also give an example of a good online event that you've been a part of and that you can recommend, maybe as a sort of inspiration? Alexandra, can you start, please?
Well, I want to say this, that I think the pandemic, obviously it's a major tragedy, but I think it's going to bring about a kind of, cultural reset. We will be forced to, start thinking about all aspects of life differently. And on the one hand, the digital aspect has really completely taken over. We are all tired of it. And at the same time, it provided, especially at the beginning, free access to events that wouldn't be free normally. And when you say, these figures, for instance, sound, these amounts sound really quite good and healthy. We have to remember that Britain is a very expensive country, and that there are a number of festivals, for example, literary festivals. Not all of them are international, but and the international ones are very well known. They would be the Edinburgh Book Festival, the Hay Festival, and maybe some smaller festivals, but generally they're not, they're not so international. But British authors and English language authors, that's also where they sell books. That's where they meet their readers. And a ticket to one of these events, so imagine a festival which may have, like the big festivals, Hay and Edinburgh, would have hundreds of events, hundreds of authors. They run for 2 weeks to 3 weeks. And a ticket to any of these events will cost between £8 to £10. And that's a lot of money. If you want to go and stay at a festival for a while and attend, 5 events during
maybe
the day.
Just to put it in perspective, you say £8 to £10. How much is a book in Wales or in England?
Well, the book prices would be similar. They would be, for example, a book would cost $7.99, $8 if it's and I'm talking about paperback. Obviously, hardback is more expensive, and also translations tend to be a bit more expensive. But as I said, the festivals are really, very much Again, not all of them. There have been some new festivals which are more connected with their local audiences. There's a fantastic festival in Bradford, and Bradford is a place where it's very ethnically diverse, and that festival kind of responds to that. But on the whole, and there would be maybe some events that are free, but on the whole, what has happened, and I thought it was really amazing at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, the Hay Festival, which normally is really expensive to go to, also because of the accommodation being very expensive, it's a small place, was completely free. You just had to register, and they had people attending from all around the world. And there was something, incredible about that, about, 1,000 people attending or more. I think the figures were actually much higher, attending one event and responding, in the chat and so on. So it created a really interesting situation where you could be part of, a number of such events. Again, I noticed that later some of these events started charging, or made it kind of not compulsory, but you can pay if you want to a certain amount or as much as you like and so on. So there's now a range of possibilities to access culture, but with the economic impact on the whole, I think we will really have to start looking at opportunities where culture will provide free access, which is something that's frowned upon here in the UK. You actually, if you receive funding, you are expected to somehow monetize what you're doing. So whereas in some parts of Europe, if you receive public funding, you're actually not allowed to charge. So it's quite a different approach.
Yeah, if I can just rebound on that, I mean, France is the absolute opposite. So there are many literary festivals all over the country, and they're free. And on the other hand, books are more expensive, but the cultural, the access to culture is seen as a positive thing, and it's a policy. So it's considered normal for people to have access to culture. One thing that you said, Alexandra, that's interesting, whenever there are these big festivals in the UK, which when one's not able to go, one sort of follows from afar, there are always last minute issues with visas. And this is something for authors. And so this is something that doesn't have a virtual world. So I imagine that there can be more conversations with people who usually don't get visas, like Palestinians, like Syrians, or many people from Africa who always at the last minute, or an Iranian, I mean, it's shocking, so-and-so hasn't gotten their visa, blah, blah, blah. So that's one thing. But I have to say, besides the whole sort of virtual fatigue, which I think everyone has, the Zoom fatigue, there have been some really interesting festivals. For example, there was just a Palestinian literature festival, which was done quite well, and all sorts of things going on. In terms of organization, I thought the Edinburgh Festival was very well organized, because it wasn't too long. Like sometimes things drag on too long. There are too many participants and it's confusing. And I thought they did a really good job. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I meant to say that as well. And thank you for mentioning the visas, because that's a really significant thing. We've always, and it wasn't just, literary festivals, but actually in the performing arts, it's been an ongoing problem. And we regularly have these meetings also with PEN, with English PEN, pens in the other countries, that where we look at the issue and we lobby the government to do something about this. So yes, it made it possible for participants for speakers to attend without these obstacles, but also we could attend festivals anywhere in the world. but also the fact that the festivals became smaller, which is what you just mentioned, I really welcomed it. I think there's something insane about, having a festival with literally 500 events, 700 authors, it's just too much. So both Hey, I thought that was really well organized, and it was really the first festival that is very well known and always, well attended, that went digital, and I really enjoyed the program. After that, I think I got a bit tired, but I also followed the Edinburgh Book Festival, and being smaller, it was, yeah. But there were, just to answer actually your question, Andre, there have been some really fantastic conversations just organized by small publishers, or there is this platform which is run completely voluntarily, which is called World Kidlit. And it's about children's books in translation, and also looking at, what's being published in other parts of the world. I could say it's based here but it's virtual. It's completely virtual, so it's not quite based in Britain. It's people who contribute to it are based in different places, and they started doing debate online and so on. So that's something that has taken off, and I think it's been really beneficial. Yeah,
I completely agree. I actually think that these kind of events actually showed us, I think, the true purpose of internet. After all those years of cat videos and watching Donald Trump, we were actually able to see something really not only interesting, but something that you could take as an inspiration and really share thoughts with people that you may never meet in person, because of the reasons that you mentioned, such as small technicalities as visas and so on. Per,
I'm not too sure.
Yes, please.
No, but I beside as a publisher, I also work as artistic director for the International Writers Stage in Malmö. So the last event we did before the COVID in February was that we squeezed in 900 people in the audience to listen to Slavoj Žižek, which seems light years ago now. But I think the digital development in this case have been immense actually this year, because as you said, it was a tsunami of events going on in the beginning of in the spring when COVID came. Everybody did a Zoom reading from their kitchen or did events and so on. And people got tired of it. It is quite tiring to sit and look up the noses of writers from their home. And if you compare that, I mean, it seemed like most literary organizers believe that we could just put up one camera and do the events just as we usually do. We have two people on stage talking to each other, and we will just film them from a distance. Compare that to, for example, how the opera houses or the theaters around the world are producing their digital events. It's an enormous difference, which is also because the concentration span of a digital event is quite narrow. So you really need to give this extra material in a way to be able to watch. And if we do, when we ask our audience what is important with a literary event, one of the main things is to be there, to meet other people at the literary event, to actually have, it's part of your identity to take part in a literary event. And that is impossible to do online, of course, and it's impossible to do right now. I enjoyed how the Stanza Poetry Festival in Scotland, for example, after M. Carson's talk at the Berlin Poetry Festival, they organized a chat room where you could actually sit and talk with other people who had watched it. But it's not the same. And it also is, if you want to do great productions, I mean, you can, as both Olivia and Alexandra say, you can bring people from all over the world and put them together. You need to do a great production still, so it's actually it's your duty to do that towards them participating. And that costs a lot of money. A great production costs a lot of money. And here we are used to, is it online? It's supposed to be for free. And it's hard to understand how we will be able to do a great production and still be able to charge for it. I don't know how that will happen, but I think we have the book business has learned a lot about how to improve digital events and how to use the medium this year, of course.
I think you've made a very important point, and to me it was very inspiring to see actually Czech theatres now joining forces together and creating some kind of, let's say, a Netflix for theatre, and trying to monetize what they do. And I actually think we'll see, but that might be a way for independent publishers to handle live events in case we need to stay digital and we need to stay online. But I completely agree. The production costs are truly high and prohibitive, and it really takes great effort to create something that has the production values of digital events that we can compare to the Met or something like that. Let me now check if we have any questions from the audience. We actually have just one, and it's for Alexandra. It's from Dana Kalinova, and Dana Kalinova says, "Hi, Alexandra. How many partners the organization Literature Across Frontiers is collaborating nowadays? And do you have a sort of survey dealing with their situation available?"
Hello, Dana. It's good to know that you are out there watching. We actually work on quite a variety of programs and projects. Which the partnership depends very much on the focus of the project. As you probably know, we also have been working quite a lot outside Europe, presenting European authors to audiences, for instance, in India, or places like Singapore and so on. We have an event that will be shown at the streamed at an Indian festival tomorrow. So the number, I wouldn't know off the top of my head how many partners we're working with at the moment, but it's quite a few. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have covered quite a lot of interesting topics and areas, and I think people who were watching received a great deal of inspiration. Thank you for that. Thank you to my wonderful guests. Those were Alexandra Bichler, Olivia Snaije, and Petr Bergtrom. Thank you so much. Also, happy holidays. I hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.